In recent months, pressure has been growing on the Biden administration from the outside, but also increasingly from within. As the resignations keep coming, could dissent in D.C. be key to an end to the bloodshed in Gaza? I'm Myriam Francois, and this is The Stream.
The director at U.S. Department of State has resigned, y'all.
The senior State Department official that oversaw arms sales just resigned because of what's happening in Palestine.
Another U.S. government official has officially resigned in protest to the Biden administration.
Rushing to provide arms to Israel, which was short-sighted, destructive, unjust, and contradictory to the very values that we publicly espouse.
It was untenable to work for and represent an administration and a president that put conditions on my own humanity.
Publicly withdrawing consent as an employee of the government and saying, I don't want to participate in this anymore, is actually quite powerful.
Many people inside state know that this is a horrific policy and can't believe that the United States government is engaged in such actions that contravene American values so directly, but the leadership is not listening.
I think we need more courage like this from government officials.
Josh Paul, Tariq Habash, Annelle Sheline. These are just some of the names of high-profile figures who have publicly stepped down. Rifts within Washington are increasingly apparent. So what is really happening in the halls of US power? Here for further discussion on this, Annelle Sheline, a former US State Department official who publicly resigned over America's Gaza response. She joins us live from Durham, North Carolina. Greg Stoker, a former US Army Ranger and activist. He joins us from Austin, Texas. And from Cairo, Jasmine Gamal, who served as a Middle East advisor and special assistant to Pentagon leadership. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being here. Annelle, can I start with you? You are one of a number of high-profile resignations in recent months. Do you have a sense that the message is maybe getting through to President Biden?
I think that the message that is getting through is probably mostly coming from political pressure building on the administration. This is an election year, and I think in many ways that is of greater concern. Obviously, my own resignation and those of others is a high-profile event, but I do think from the administration's perspective, they're probably mostly concerned about things like the uncommitted vote, and other efforts to try to show President Biden that this is going to be an electoral issue for him. And if he doesn't change policy, he risks losing the election over the Gaza policy.
Greg, you are a US veteran. Veterans, particularly dissident veterans, have played a really important role in the Vietnam War, in the Iraq War. Do you see yourself as part of this lineage of dissident veterans, and why are they important?
Yeah, it's important, but it's harder for them to dismiss us in terms of the typical narrative of being terrorist sympathizers when, you have a bunch of guys who've actually engaged what the United States would consider terrorist forces. So it's just, you brought up Vietnam. There's a lot of different activism movements that served as a confluence for the Vietnam backlash. But again, that did last 10 years of constant activism and direct action.
Jasmine, you served 3 secretaries of defense advising on Middle East affairs. This is hardly America's first unpopular foreign policy decision. How significant are the levels of dissent we are seeing?
Well, I think certainly more than anything I had ever seen in my time in government. I was in government for 8 years under the Obama administration, serving at the Department of Defense. If you'll remember at the time, we had the war against ISIS, we had the Syria war, we had the Arab Spring. There was obviously a lot of criticism over US policy at the time when it came to these issues. And for many of us who are serving inside government at the time, a lot of us felt that we had a role to play inside the administration to represent different points of view, to advocate for policies that we felt were best for long-term U.S. interests. But the level of dissent, the level of resignations, the level of protests, obviously nothing like we're seeing today. And I think that I've talked about this a lot with former colleagues of mine who served back then. When we talk about what we're seeing now, people like Annelle and sort of, these really brave stances that a lot of our former colleagues are taking. What I loved about something Annelle said on another, I think it was the Democracy Now! Interview, Annelle, that you did. I loved the fact that even though you were describing why you felt like you had to leave, you also made it a point to say that there are other people who can't leave, for example, because of their families, or they have to provide, or their career prospects, things that they had to think about. That really ate them up inside. And so they felt that they would, because they had to stay inside, that they would do their part to do what they can. And so I think that's really important to remember too, Myriam, is that dissent comes in different forms, and we need people inside government making those arguments as much as we need people resigning and people outside government, activists, analysts, journalists. It's all part of a spectrum, I think, of society that puts different kinds of pressure on administrations to make one whole point.
Well, on that point, I spoke exclusively to Feds United for Peace, an anonymous dissident group of thousands of US government federal employees who came together after October the 7th. Listen to this.
The brutality of the war itself is so visceral for so many of us that you can't help but respond. We're also responding to this as federal workers and employees and people who are patriots and want the best for our country. And as such, what we can see is that the war that Israel is engaged in, that we are supporting as the United States, is harmful, not only, of course, to the Palestinians, but also to the United States, to our interests.
We believe that senior officials are cognizant that we are in violation of domestic laws as well as international laws. And yet this policy continues because ultimately the buck stops with the president.
The support that the United States has been giving to Israel has been at this incredibly high level for very long, and it's been uncritical, it's been unconditional. That has to change. This is the kind of thing that we are now looking at as workers of the federal government, and we say it is not possible to continue with the old status quo.
So many people who are tuned in to the news that is coming out of Gaza, and for those people on the ground, your videos, your voices, they are not being lost. There are people in the halls of power, if you will, who are listening to you.
Annelle, as the feds point out, unconditional support for Israel has long been a bipartisan issue in America. Do you see this changing at all?
I do see it changing. I think the question is just whether the change is going to happen quickly enough to save the lives of the Palestinians trapped inside Gaza. We've already seen the ways that this is no longer as bipartisan. I do think that the Israeli government has really thrown in its lot with Republicans in a way that may be detrimental to their long-term efforts to maintain this unconditional flow of massive amounts of money that the US gives to Israel every year, as well as the weapons. I do think that we're also seeing a shift now in the context, as was mentioned from Feds United for Peace, that these videos that are coming out as an employee at the State Department, your inbox is full of the statistics of the dead, of the casualties, of how many aid trucks are getting in, as well as often links to some of these social media videos. So it is something that the State Department is engaging with every day. And as Jasmine mentioned, for many people, it is extremely devastating to have to go in every day and be faced with that. Whether or not they're working directly on this policy or not, it is inescapable. And I think that is contributing to the internal dissent that we're seeing. But I do think that this is a generational issue. We're seeing young people in particular feeling very differently, and much of that does have to do with the ways that young people receive information through social media, whereas unfortunately much of the American mainstream media is not covering the devastation of what is happening inside Gaza in the same way that those of us that are getting information more directly from those people, that we see what is really happening and what's happening on the ground.
Yeah.
I just hope that this public pressure that is building from inside the administration and outside the administration is going to finally force a shift.
Yeah, but Greg, I want to give you an opportunity to come back. Obviously, any thoughts on that video? But I also want to ask you about the fact that Biden has described himself as a Zionist, and you've made videos around some of the dangers of Christian Zionism. I mean, how powerful is the influence of Christian Zionism within the halls of power? Is it something we should be concerned about?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've recently been talking about this because there's been a lot of burgeoning awareness about APAC and the Israel lobby and other special interest groups that support the Israeli state. But you have to understand that over 100 million Americans, not all of them are Christian Zionists, but a lot of them are evangelicals who seriously believe, for their own religious purposes, in the existence of the state of Israel. And a lot of politicians, a lot of Christian evangelical politicians in the Senate and in Congress would support Israel unconditionally, no matter what, whether or not APAC existed, whether or not they were getting lobbied by the energy sector or the military industrial complex. They would support Israel no matter what. That's a huge voting bloc in America.
Well, no discussion of American democracy could be complete without a reference to the significant influence of one foreign government's lobby on US policy. I am, of course, talking about APAC. Check this out. APAC paid Joe Biden $11 million to aid Israel with ethnic cleansing. The Israelis are already selling waterfront properties in Gaza. Forcing the Palestinians out has always been the plan. Jasmine, do you agree? Has the plan always been for the US government to get the Palestinians out of Gaza?
The US government, no. I would say, obviously, the Israeli government successive Israeli governments have made their opinions clear when it came to peace with the Palestinians. I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been prime minister for years and years on and off, but other prime ministers as well have been very intransigent when it comes to peace with the Palestinians. Different presidents have gone about it differently. And I think, as you said, Myriam, President Biden is very uniquely, when it comes to US presidents, pro-Israel. He has said himself that he's a Zionist. He has talked about how a meeting with Golda Meir, then Prime Minister of Israel, at a very early stage of his career, shaped him profoundly. And we're seeing the effects of that today. And that brings me to a point that's really important that both of my co-panelists have touched upon. This is a generational issue. You know, these types of really policies that have been set in stone for decades, they take decades to unravel and to change. And just like Joe Biden was shaped by his meeting with Golda Meir, future leaders of the United States, whether it's in the Senate, the Congress, or the executive branch, are going to be shaped by what's happening today. And that's why it's important to think about the long term. Everything that people are doing now to speak out and act against the war in Gaza and unconditional support to Israel is influencing the future leadership of this country. And I think that's a positive thing.
Greg, I want to ask you, officially, the US government says it wants a two-state solution and peace in the region. But in practice, it isn't supporting a peace process of any kind and is, in fact, arming and funding Israel's settler expansion. I've always been taught to ignore what a man says and to look at his actions instead. Is the world being gaslit by America right now?
I mean, absolutely. A lot of the Biden administration's talking points are completely performative. Not only that, they know that Israel is not specifically targeting Hamas. They don't have any exit strategy. They don't have any defined tactical or operational goals. And, you know, as someone with a background in military intelligence, I know this, and I don't even have access to the information. They haven't had any standard of proof of Hamas presence in any hospitals. And they haven't, you know, released any compelling evidence that they've taken out, or killed, or captured any of Hamas leadership. So they're just dragging this thing out. and they're going to continue to supply Israel with weapons until it becomes politically untenable. But the thing is, like, we're talking about dissent. We're so involved in this issue for our own reasons, but the average American citizen, the average American voter, isn't even touched by this. I've been talking to a lot of people that are just like, oh, it's the Middle East. This is what happens in the Middle East. They have a murky understanding of history, and they think this has been happening for thousands of years, and what are they going to do about it? So, I mean, the dissent is significant. I'd say it's unprecedented in the modern era, since Vietnam, but awareness still takes time to grow, and people need to be motivated through self-interest. Like, why is unconditional support of Israel bad for you?
Right. Well, it does seem like anger is growing among some US voters over the economic priorities of the government. This guy has some choice words.
You know what's absolutely insane to me is I got to go out of town and work 4 hours away from my home and away from my daughter just to make a paycheck, just to make ends meet. I got to go work outside in the pouring down rain and then the mud and beat myself half to death. Meanwhile, the Israelis got subsidized housing and free education and free healthcare, and they get monthly allowances, all bought and paid for by the United States taxpayer. They're getting tens of billions of dollars a year sent to them just to bomb, murder, and maim innocent men, women, and children, and to slaughter humanitarian aid workers. It's insane.
Annelle, a majority of US voters now disapprove of Israel's actions. And yet on the same day as Biden condemned the killing of the World Central Kitchen aid workers by Israel, he approved the transfer of thousands more bombs. Why is Biden seemingly ignoring the views of the majority of Americans?
I don't have a great answer for that. It is really confusing. I do think Yasmin's answer about how, because it took decades for us to get to where we are, it is going to take, I hope not decades, but it's going to take a while. And as she mentioned, this is something that has been part of President Biden's ideology for most of his very long career. I do hope that those around him, including apparently his own wife, possibly, have been telling him that this needs to stop. I do think that, one particular concern to what Greg was mentioning as far as how the average American voter may not be thinking about this, the concern is that Benjamin Netanyahu's political future depends on this violence continuing. This is how he's staying in power. And so his best incentive is to continue the massacre of everyone inside of Gaza, and then to expand the violence. We saw Israel hit the Iranian consulate building in Damascus. We've heard them state their plan to invade Lebanon. And the concern there is that then U.S. service members, the U.S. military, will be dragged in. Americans could lose their lives because Biden is not telling Netanyahu that he has to exercise restraint. He cannot invade Lebanon. He cannot expand this war. The U.S. is not going to support that. Instead, the message he keeps sending is, I would rather there be fewer civilian casualties, but I'll send you weapons either way. And so what reason would Netanyahu have to do anything other than what best serves his political interests, which again, directly contravene those of Joe Biden?
Yeah. Well, every year the White House hosts an official iftar during the Muslim month of Ramadan. But this year it was a little different.
The Biden administration tried to host an iftar dinner tonight, and they had to cancel it because not a single Muslim showed up. The only people in attendance were people who worked for the Biden administration. There was not a single person invited who showed up. This is the most beautiful collective from the entire Muslim community that I could even imagine.
Jasmine, we know that these events are typically symbolic, but they are important, aren't they? What do you read from this?
Yeah, that's funny. I was just actually watching that video that you showed the other day. I think this is It's another case of individuals having to decide, okay, how do I want to approach this? So when people were invited to the iftar, a lot of Muslim leaders went back to the communities, to their communities, and said, hey, listen, we're invited to this iftar. Should we go or not? And a lot of them listened to their communities who said, absolutely not after everything that has happened. We've been trying to get the Biden administration's attention for months on end. They've been either ignoring us or using us for political gain. Absolutely not. However, there are some people who decided, you know what, I am going to go. I'm going to look President Biden in the face. I'm going to show him pictures of dead Palestinians in Gaza, and I'm going to, represent and make a point. And like I said, both of those are necessary. The fact that barely anybody who was invited attended was a huge message to President Biden and his administration. And the couple of people, I'm talking about one doctor, one Palestinian American doctor, Dr. Thaer, I think, if I'm not mistaken, he went and he delivered a letter from an orphaned girl in Gaza, Palestinian girl. I think she was 8 years old. He gave the letter to President Biden. He said, I want you to read this letter, and I want you to know that I am now going to walk away, just like you have been walking away from us and our community for the last few months. And that was pretty powerful as well. So the Biden administration is getting these messages everywhere it looks. And as we've been saying throughout this program, most of this is on President Biden himself. Even his advisors now are telling him, we have to switch gears. We have to stop. I mean, when you have Senator Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi actually saying enough is enough, we have to stop and suspend military assistance to Israel. The tide has shifted. It has shifted, and it's important to keep this pressure up in order to affect that change moving forward. You can't stop now. That's the real thing. The real challenge is going to be keeping this up even when this issue is out of the headlines.
Greg, I want to ask you, with your military background, what are your concerns with regards to what the US could be being dragged into here?
Well, I mean, going back to old reporting, military reporting. In 2006, Israel invaded southern Lebanon. They got rolled up. That's the official, excuse the colloquial term. They were strategically defeated in the field, and there was some smoke and mirror stuff on the global scale to make it seem like it wasn't a defeat. Definitively, that's the position of the United States Army war colleges. And they do not have the military capabilities to take on Hezbollah. That doesn't mean they won't try. They'd be insane to, but everything they've been doing has been completely without operational sense or strategic awareness. So it's anyone's game. As one of my co-panelists mentioned before, it's in Netanyahu's interest to keep this going. He's been wanting to get American boots on the ground since the start. I think you can make an easy argument that he's wanted to have further deepening U.S. involvement in the actual military action of this multi-front war. I'm not so sure that the United States or the United States military wants to do that.
Well, Annelle, if I could give you the last word here, if you could speak right now to the people who are on the fence, the potential dissidents, what would you say to them right now?
So many people are watching what's happening and are grieving and are devastated. So I would encourage people, to put up a public display of support, whether like it's a ceasefire in Gaza sign, for example, because I think it's seeing other people around you that it is becoming a greater point of consensus. Whereas I think earlier on in the war, there was, shock over the Hamas attack. But I think for many, many people now, this is so disproportionate. We're violating US laws, we're violating international laws. My hope is that increasingly people will just agree there must be a ceasefire. This cannot continue. We as Americans cannot support this any longer. And the rest of the world has already said that. So I would encourage, and those who are inside government, many of them are doing important work. They're doing important work on this issue in hopes that if President Biden were to change his mind and adopt a new policy, there would be these measures ready to go. And I know this is happening. There are people ready with these accountability measures. It's just they're not going to go into effect unless the president decides that that is what he wants.
Well, sadly, that's a wrap. But thank you to our guests, Greg, Jasmine, and Annelle. And thank you all for watching. Did you enjoy the show? Talk to us on social media. If there is a conversation or topic you'd like to flag to us, we want to hear about it. Use the hashtag or the handle AJStream, and we will look into it. Stay awake, and I'll see you soon.